Recording.
All right, guys, welcome to the Love Rising podcast. Clara and I are just going to kind of riff a little bit about boundaries today because, of course, with our membership site, we are talking all about boundaries this month, and that's just something huge that both Clara and I have spent a lot of time talking about. So we are going to kind of intro you into why boundaries are important, the types that we look at, and then we're also going to talk some about the essential oils that we really like to use to help us and support us in setting those boundaries. So today's episode is going to be a little shorter, hopefully. And then moving forward, we'll have a longer one going into more detail with some awesome exercises that you can go and do for these boundaries, for setting them. And if you aren't part of our membership site and you want to experience some support around setting boundaries, be sure you join us on this journey so that we can all do that together. So let's kind of dive into how important boundaries are. So Clara, do you just want to kind of jump into what that looks like?
Yeah, I think boundaries are something that have become one of the most important how would you say, like lessons or practices for me as far as an intentional life. I think if we want to live an intentional life where we are working towards large goals, where we have enough space and time for ourselves to make sure we're taking care of ourselves, we talk about on this podcast about health, like whole person health, like physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health. And if you don't have boundaries or you don't have some semblance of boundaries, it's really hard to do all the practices and have the time to keep yourself healthy. So I think when we talk about boundaries and how important they are paramount. They are one of the most important things, because without them, we will lose intention, we will feel scattered. If you think about it in terms of like a container, right? Boundaries are the container for all of the amazing flowing things you get to do. So they're the container for physical health when we have boundaries around what we eat and what we don't eat and when we eat, or when we have boundaries around the people in our lives and how much they get from us, or how much how our time is spent. Like, we need these parameters and these containers so that the magic can happen inside. And so that's why I think they're important. How do you find them to be important? Okay.
Yeah, something that you said was that you lose intention. And I think that really sparked something in me that made me, actually yesterday we interviewed Gypsy Nye, and that will be coming out to you guys in September. But we were talking about how we can lose ourselves almost when you don't set in your boundaries, because when you don't set your boundaries, you start to give way to different people's energies, different people's lives, different people's decisions, things like that. And you really don't hold space for your truest self, your highest self, and your own energy and your own decisions. So I think it's really important when we look at it from that standpoint to go, if I don't set my intentions, I'm going to lose myself to things that and it's okay to, for her example, it was, I basically moved across the country into my boyfriend's life, and it was his friends, and it was his business, and it was his life and his house. And it was like, I didn't have these boundaries around what I wanted and what I needed. And so that it's not selfish to set those intentions. And I want to make that point. It's actually very, very empowering, and others will respect you more when you set those boundaries. But we have to have those boundaries in order to flourish and let our energy and our truest self radiate. So I think that's a really important way to look at it as well, is when we don't get clear on our boundaries and we don't live a life of intentional loving boundaries, we start to lose ourselves into the other life of others, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I love that. I think the most simple definition of boundary I've come across is where I end and you begin. Mm-hmm. So like, where is that space where I end and something else begins, or someone else begins? And do I know what that is? Like, can I push up against that and feel some sort of stop, right? Like, and this totally, and we'll get into this as far as like people pleasing and how that's, you know, very much it's a boundary issue, right? And so it's also like I do this, I'm guilty of this, I think everyone's guilty of this. We take things really personally, right? If you're familiar with the book, The Four Agreements, like one of those agreements is to not take things personally. And that's a boundaries, right? It's like, I am here, you are there, you're experiencing some sort of, you know, upset from maybe something I said or something I did. And I don't have to take that personally. Obviously, we want to be nice and kind and everything to people. So if you have done some wrong or something, you can say sorry. But a lot of times we get scared that if we set boundaries, we're going to upset somebody else, right? If I say I don't answer texts after 9 p.m. at night, and that's my boundary, that's where I end, then we feel guilty, or we feel like we did something wrong because we didn't respond to someone until the next morning or whatever it is, right? And so it's super important that like there's this element of like not taking things personally, right? It's like, and this is kind of getting into the how of why we might do boundaries or set boundaries, is like we have to know this is where I am, this is my feelings, this is my reality, and this is yours, and I'm sorry, you know, it's too bad if that upsets someone else, but like this is where I am, this is my personal boundary.
I think something that's important to say there, because we do talk about Marianne Williamson all the time, right? And how she talks about she talks about, you know, there's nowhere where you begin and I end. And so I think it's important to point out we're talking spiritual versus like the human experience, physical. So like there is no where you begin and I end spiritually. Like we're all one continuum. Yes, that's important. But at the same time, in this human experience, we do have to set those boundaries so that we almost can live in a more pure spiritual playing field, if that makes sense at all. That's a little woo-woo,
right.
But basically it's kind of important to point that out, because, you know, somebody might come and say, well, wait a minute, you guys talk about how it's like, no, where you begin and I end. And now you're saying to set these boundaries. But I think it's important that we do set those boundaries so that our highest self spiritually can thrive, as well as this person's, as well as your neighbors. And then of course that's a continuum, but then setting those boundaries so that we're not interfering with one another's, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I love that distinction, and it's super important that, yeah, we are both human and divine. That is so true. And so, yes, all minds are joined in that way, that we are all accessible to each other at any time. And the thing that sustains us all is love. But in this human manifested form experience, for us to be able to connect to that self, we do have to create some sort of container. Right? Mm-hmm. It's like I think it's called a crucible. Like it's a container for something to transform. I think a crucible holds like metal, and it gets heated and the metal turns into liquid. It's like part of a old school metalworking, I guess. But like I think of that crucible idea of like, I need a container so that I can transform within it, so that the things that are coming at me don't, you know, disperse me. Like I have to kind of have this container to work within.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, you know, like the way I describe boundaries is take no shit, give no shit. And it's like kind of a good way to look at it. So let's chat a little bit about what Clara and I love, essential oils, and how we can use oils to really help us ground and be solid and clear in our boundaries.
Yes. So as far as like tools to use, right? We're always talking about different tools. How do we make this come down to earth and make sense, and overcome maybe some of the people-pleasing tendencies that we might have had. Indecisiveness is another thing I see that, you know, probably informs a lot of lack of boundaries, is like this indecisiveness. And so one thing that I use, I'm a pretty decisive person by nature, but I think any entrepreneur gets in these headspaces sometimes, or anyone, you know, where it's like, oh, you have these two options that seem really attractive, or two options that don't seem attractive at all, and you have to choose between one or the other in a, like, at a time frame that isn't ideal. Like, it's like, okay, I have to make this decision, and I just can't make the decision, and it creates a lot of struggle for you. And again, that's a boundary issue, right? That's like not knowing kind of who you are and where you stand and what parameters within which you're willing to experience life. And so I use essential oils in lack of decisiveness a lot. And what I call the essential oils that I use are the masculine oils. If you were to Google that, a lot of stuff would come up, the masculine oils. And when we're talking about boundaries, in a lot of ways, we are talking about the masculine. We're talking about the box within which the feminine can flow, the creativeness. And so I use masculine oils to help make decisions when I'm feeling indecisive. So ones that I use a lot are vetiver and cedarwood. You'll notice that these are both from trees. They're both really musky. They both have a pretty powerful earthy scent. So it's that very like groundedness. So I'll just diffuse them and do a meditation and try to clear my mind, not try and make a decision happen, just clear it so that the correct decision can surface. And then with the help of the essential oils and that grounded kind of masculine decisiveness that comes with that aroma and that energetic vibration from cedarwood or vetiver, then an answer normally surfaces. So that's one way that we can, on these bigger decisions, right? There's a lot of, like, if you have a lot of indecisiveness, if that's like a big problem of yours, it's like, you're like, where do we go to eat? I can't decide. Like, you could carry cedarwood around with you and smell it and do a little mind clearing, like, you know, a minute, and just kind of go with the gut, like, right after you have that smell, what comes up? Chinese, like, that's what came up. So that's where we're going, and like help you to have those decisive moments and like kind of practice them.
Yeah, I love that. A couple more that I like to use are rosemary, and that one's good for actually clearing negative energy. So you can clear the space while you're focusing on setting those boundaries. Maybe you're meditating. You can actually put some on your heart to kind of help clear that space. Another one might be basil. And so basil can also, if you diffuse it, kind of helps to clear the mind and heart. Another one, you can just, with some coconut oil, it's a spicy oil, so you can put it on your heart space to help. Maybe if you're in difficult situations, again, deciding, because we're talking about boundaries, and deciding goes kind of hand in hand with that. So using some of these oils to help ground you, clear the negative energy, maybe that's lingering. And that negative energy most likely is from other people's decisions or other people's boundaries. So kind of clearing that out. And you can do that through the rosemary, and then using the basil along with maybe the cedarwood or something to kind of hold that space, clear the heart, clear the mind, and then be able to confidently and with an easeful energy.
Yeah.
Anyways, setting those boundaries. So those are some good oils as well.
Yeah. And I like rosemary. I just have my book. That's why I'm looking over here, but it's the oil of knowledge and transition. So really about knowing, right? Like, boundaries are about knowing, this is me, this is you, and this is where I end, this is where you begin. And so, like, oil of knowledge, so it says emotions addressed are confusion, difficulty adjusting, or transitioning. So a lot of times when we do transition, that could be a time energetically or physically, like to another physical place, like we move, or energetically we're transitioning from, you know, a certain level of consciousness to another level of consciousness. Like, we need help. We need different boundaries. We might have to set different boundaries, right? Like, I think that's so good, actually. Like, this idea that as we up level our lives, we could say, as we become more intentional, our boundaries change. And I've noticed this with every level of success. You could call it success, you could call it consciousness, that I've kind of, as I've stepped up the staircase, I do require completely different parameters in which to work. So I didn't used to have boundaries on my email or my communication or my texting. Now I do. As your influence grows, you could say you require more and more solid boundaries, and that's almost how your influence grows. It's kind of questionable as to whether it's the influence that grows or it's that you're becoming more and more solid in your own personal boundaries. And so, yeah, I like Rosemary, that help with transitions as we grow our influence, as we grow our consciousness level.
I love that. So you guys, hopefully you'll tune into our next one. This is kind of gearing us up for the actual steps on how to set your boundaries. So we'll talk more about what those specific boundaries, what types of boundaries there are. And then of course we have the take no shit, give no shit exercise that we'll go through both in the podcast, and we'll talk about it in our membership site. So be sure you jump in and be part of that gathering.
Yes. Thank you guys for being here. And just so that we leave you with one practical step, as we love to do at the end of each podcast episode, I would just explore your boundaries in, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 different aspects of your life. So physical, that could be like relationship, like your physical body. Energetic, which could also be considered emotional, like where is your emotional boundary? Where do you let other people affect you emotionally? Do you want that to be the case, or do you not want that to be the case? Financial, do you have financial boundaries around where your money goes, how you spend your money? And then time boundaries. Do you have boundaries around what time goes where, how you spend your time, how you spend your free time, how you spend your work time, all that stuff. So journal, think about those 4 aspects of boundaries and how they currently are in your life. Just how they currently are. No judgment, just awareness around them. Does that sound good, Kylee?
Sounds perfect.
Okay. Cool.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.